So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alexander Klimberg from the Hague Center for Strategic Studies. I'm also the director of the Global Commission for Stability of Cyberspace Initiative. If you were at the previous panel on artificial intelligence, you might get the impression that cyber is an old term and nobody's going to use it anymore. The future is all AI. And actually, cyber is a term that's been around for quite a while, and it's changed quite a bit as well. It used to be all about social aspects. It used to be about community. And today it's about war. So in the heyday of the 1990s, the whole notion of social aspects of cyber, for instance, cyber stalking, cyber crime, cyber community, they outweighed any other interpretation. But this changed, and slowly security issues took over. Around 1995, Time magazine ran a headline saying cyber war in big capital letters. And in 1999, a high-ranking US defense official briefed Congress on the first large cyber intrusion against the United States, which was codenamed Titan Rain, and he called it a cyber war. In the very same year, the US military issued its first official document on what is now called information operations. And from that point on, cyber conflict has been a fact of life. But we still don't know exactly what it is. So cyber is omnipresent in the news. Most of you will have heard of the NotPetya attacks of 2017, where a cyber attack went beyond its proposed targets in the Ukraine to hit a number of multinationals, such as FedEx and Maersk, and may have caused up to $1 billion worth of damages. Now, the act has since been attributed to one government, but we still don't know exactly what to call it. Was it a cyber war attack? Was it a cyber terrorist incident? Was it cybercrime? Indeed, more than 20 years after the US government published JP 313, the first official document, Information Operations, and 4 billion internet users later, we still don't know exactly how to spell cyber war, which is why we probably don't know exactly what it means. Some of you might write it as a single word, like the organizers did, implying that it is something completely new. Some of you might as two separate words, implying that cyber is simply another type of warfare. And some of you who haven't made up their minds might just put a hyphen in between. So we have a great panel here to discuss the subject. So Chris Painter is a former coordinator for cyber issues in the US State Department, a job that was equivalent to Assistant Secretary of State position. Marilyn Magra is acting director of NATO Combined Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, a research organization in Estonia. Radoslav Danilak is the co-founder and CEO of Taichum, a cloud chip manufacturer, and Joseph Huang is an assistant professor at the National Defense University in Taiwan. Now, before we start, the organizers have asked me to point out that this is to be an interactive session rooted in technology using the Silo.com app. But since I don't actually have the pad in front of me or any way to access it, I suppose that somebody will, at one point, put on something on the screen right there. So please let me know, since I can't see the screen, what it exactly says. And maybe we can actually take your questions also the old-fashioned way. Simply raise your hand if you have a comment. So first, I'd like to take it right to my panel, and perhaps Chris. So how do you spell cyber war? Is it something new?
So, I mean, I think you told a little bit about the history of this, and I think often this idea of cyber war is an overhyped concept, where the press particularly likes to say cyber war. Everything is a cyber war. I think people throw around that term very loosely, and I don't think we really are at risk of a all-out, single source sort of cyber war where nothing else is happening. I think cyber certainly will be a part of almost every traditional conflict we'll see from now on. We've seen it already in Georgia and other things. Cyber will certainly be a component of a lot of different threats that we're facing. And I'd say it's more accurate to say that we're in a state of constant cyber conflict. And often that conflict, and almost always that conflict so far, has been below the thresholds of what most people would say is an all-out war that would trigger things like the rights to self-defense, et cetera. But that doesn't mean it's not been serious. I mean, certainly we've had very serious intrusions. We've had very serious attacks. We've had very serious events like the attempts to undermine not just our democracy in the United States, but really around the world. We've had very serious incidents that you mentioned, like the NotPetya attack, which had really widespread damage, or WannaCry, both by nation states, Russia in the first and North Korea in the second. So it is a very serious issue, and I think it helps to really think about what the harms are that we're seeing, what are actually the motivation, the actors, whether they be cyber criminals or nation states, and not get caught up as much in using the term cyber war for everything we see. I think that makes it hard, really, to figure out what your responses are and to really moderate it.
So Maryla, does NATO even recognize cyber warfare as a concept?
Well, NATO has declared cyber operations as a separate domain of warfare. That means that NATO definitely recognizes that cyber is and is going to be used in current and future conflicts, just as you said, Chris. And elements that we've seen so far, attacks on the electricity grids or manipulation of elections, everything, all of this can be used as part of conflicts. Most probably something like, I see cyber being used as artillery was or planes were in older battles, which aimed at having an effect on weakening the enemy's defense. So that is the role of cyber currently.
So that's an interesting approximation. So one used to say that, for instance, airplanes were only used for artillery spotting until people discovered you could use them for something else. And then for 50, 60 years, there was the saying that the Air Force will never win a war. And then, of course, the 1999 campaign against Serbia occurred. So, Josef, what do you think about the difference between cyber war in terms of traditional combat capability or cyber as a new strategic warfare capability?
Yeah. Sorry about that, because of jet lag. Actually, from what I understand, if we see cyberspace as a potential battleground, I think cyber won't be to be the old, because cyberspace is a potential battleground, and we have to fight for it. And for states, they compete to another in order to dominate this cyberspace. So in terms of the term of cyber war, I will go for cyber warfare as well, because even though we have an AI problem right now, but I think if we see cyberspace as a potential battleground, AI is only just one of the technical stuff. So, but in terms of the whole area, cyberspace, I think we have to understand it very clearly and very carefully as well. So I think a cyber war won't be the old. Yeah, that's my idea.
I would say, just to comment on that, there is this connection between AI and cyber, and neither of these are really new discussions. I mean, we've been talking about autonomous lethal weapons for 20 years. So now that we're talking about AI, which kind of advances them and makes them maybe quicker, that's the label that's being given to them. And I think the panel that we just saw various dimensions of AI, but this is one of them. That's also been a debate with cyber. When you get to the point where you're trying to use cyber capabilities, and I know we'll talk about this more, either for defense or for offense, and you automate them, which many people say you have to act at the speed of light and take the person out of the middle, that causes some real challenges, because we really haven't worked out the policy debates, just like we haven't worked out the policy debates with AI and lethal force.
Radoslav, just want to ask you, do you think cyber capabilities amount to effectively the introduction of the airplane as an impact on art of war, or is it more like the introduction of gunpowder?
Well, I think it's more wider. You know, the cyber aspect has from, you know, creating chaos, you know, scaring people, to shutting down critical infrastructure, you know, turning off the water and so on, communication, through basically actually in combat disabling the, you know, missile, what happened in Syria recently. So the cyber warfare has very broader range. I would say it's more than like airplane, because airplane was used in many aspects, from, you know, from spy to basically bombing to spotting and so on, to today unmanned you know, vehicles and drones. So I think the cyber aspect has a very, very wide range of tools.
So how is it actually to have a casus belli, a cause for war, due to a cyber attack? So for instance, the US government and many other governments insist that the UN Charter should apply completely to cyberspace and cyber operations. That means also the right for self-defense applies completely, and that also you can be attacked via cyber means. What effectively is the threshold for that to be a significant enough incident that we could actually say that a use of force or an armed attack has occurred, and we therefore have a right for self-defense?
Well, First of all, I think it's important to maintain that international law applies in cyberspace. And that's a principle that countries, both East and West, have agreed upon. That's happened through the UN group of governmental experts, through their reports agreed in 2013-15. It's also been reinforced through NATO heads of states and governments, and at other high levels through repeated times. However, the devil is in the details, and really, as soon as it becomes to details, notably the right to self-defense, that's where the opinions East and West differ. However, the right of self-defense is triggered by an armed attack, and legally, it doesn't really matter whether the effects of those armed attacks are reached in cyber or elsewhere. According to the International Court of Justice, it is the consequences, the scale and effect that matters. And theoretically, we can think of a cyber attack against a hydro plant or a dam or a nuclear electricity plant that results in thousands of lives. So the criteria there is death, injury, and significant major damage to property.
I think there's this tendency to try to make cyber its own special little shiny object that's different from everything else, and it's not. It's grounded in the physical world. And the fact is that even though people spend an ungodly amount of time trying to figure out what level of a cyber event would trigger the right to self-defense under international law, when does it rise to the level, you're quite right. It's looking at the factors. And the fact is that's the way it is in the physical world, too. We don't have a bright line test in the physical world for deciding when an act rises to the level of triggering the right to self-defense. You looked at factors like lethality, who gets, is there death, is there property damage, what's the scale of it? And even then, at the end of the day, for a state to react, it's a political decision. They decide whether or not they're going to act. Even if they have the right to act, they may not decide to act in a particular way. So I think part of this has to be demystifying cyber to some extent. Understanding cyber is just like the rest of the world. Now, how you apply those rules, there are some nuances to it because cyber networks, cyber effects are different. There are hard questions, I think, like what happens if you have a cyber attack that takes out your stock exchange and takes out your financial system? No death, no physical injury. Is that sufficient? But to some extent, those questions are like how many angels could you put on the head of a pin? People spend too much time, I think, trying to think about those when in a sense, it's not exactly we'll know it when we see it, but in the physical world, that's somewhat what it is. You apply a list of factors and you decide, and I think that's what you'll do in cyberspace too.
So you say that effectively it's nothing different than from any other type of attack, but if we had attacks, for instance, on Maersk or FedEx that were physical and amounted to $300–400 million worth of damages individually, there would probably be a much more robust response than what we saw recently. Or do you see that differently?
Well, I would say that what is different, and so far we have seen no real responses to international incidents such as election hacks, not because nations are not willing to do it, but because there is an issue with attribution. And going back to the previous question of is the role of cyberwar and whether it's incremental or radical, or I definitely think it's a step-by-step approach. And as we see developments in the thinking of attribution, we probably see changes in that as well, because as nations go more confident about attributing attacks targeted against them, they will be more willing to take up action about it.
Yeah, I think it's that in part, but I think people often use attribution as a crutch in these areas, and attribution is not impossible in cyberspace, as we all know, and we've done it recently with NotPetya and with WannaCry and other things. But I think it's also indicative of a lack of two things. One, political will to actually impose consequences for these actions and take action. That's changing to some extent, but I think it's still not there. And two, there's this problem where we haven't mainstreamed this issue. We still treat this issue as a separate issue, this technical issue where senior policymakers, whether it be presidents or prime ministers or ministers, yeah, we've made a lot of progress in the last 10 years, but they still don't really understand this deeply as a core issue and just draw it in as they would any other thing that would happen, like a physical attack. And an example I was pointing to just the other day was the big Munich Security Conference is held in Munich every year, and it's a great conference, but then there were 10 cyber side events, which were great, but no real cyber events on the main stage. And that wasn't reaching the people you need to reach. It wasn't reaching the national security advisors. It wasn't reaching the defense ministers, the foreign ministers, the leaders who need to hear about that. Instead, there was the same tribe of cyber gypsies who would go from meeting to meeting and have this echo chamber, which was a fun group, but still, they're not the people who need to know these things. And I think that colors the action where you have, for instance, Theresa May being able to act really quickly when the Salisbury poisoning happened, because everyone really viscerally understood that. But when you had some of the big cyber events, that action takes much longer and it's not quite as strong.
So you picked up on a number of points there, and by the way, I prefer the term the traveling circus, which is, of course, also quite popular. But I want to come back on the notion, first of all, of information warfare and election hacking, which you mentioned beforehand, and ask the question, is that something that really falls within the remit of, for instance, the UN Group of Governmental Experts discussions? Do we really consider these types of activities to be cyber operations that could potentially rise to the level of an Article 51?
Well, I wouldn't rule out anything, but and that's it refers to the same debate on what exactly is constituting an armed attack and how do nations feel about it. Ultimately, it is a political decision, and what are the causes? What is the effect of the attack? Does it cause injuries? Does it cause death? Does it cause significant property damage? Every case should be measured case by case basis separately.
Russell, a question for you. Normally within international law, integrity or availability are considered to be issues that you use to judge if an attack has been successful or not. But confidentiality is not considered to be important. In information security, of course, we consider confidentiality, integrity, and availability to be equally important. And if confidentiality is violated so strongly that you also, for instance, have your accessibility of your information system imperiled, that could obviously have real kinetic effect. How do you see that? Is a cyber attack only something that interrupts integrity and availability and not confidentiality?
So, you know, let's think about, it's about the perception of the people and populace. You know, majority of people sitting in the room probably get in some way cyber attacks from, you know, home banking or, you know, trying to, you know, through the spam getting to their personal information and so on. So probably a lot of population get exposed to that. And it's kind of pest and annoying stuff, but people live through that. So compared to basically attacks when people die, it has completely different emotional exposure. Very few people saw somebody dying up front of them, and you know, however, it has still a huge emotional exposure while they are exposed to cyber activities. So basically, you know, there is different threshold level. In my opinion, I agree with that until significant mass casualty will happen, I don't think that you know, society will be willing to basically go to military conflict for cyber attack. And you know, again, cyber is not confidentiality kind of attack of revealing information is not something new. You know, in the past, newspapers have been disclosing, you know, confidential information. You know, let's remember Watergate and so on. It's just the tools change, but the concept existed, and you know, I would see that in same context as the releasing confidential information. That's pretty what it is, except it's happening in much larger scale and much lower threshold. You know, personal information of people get showed up, which is, in the past, it was too much effort for too little reward. But now, the traditional methods, like, you know, obtaining confidential information and so on, publishing them, they got automated, threshold got lowered, and that's also is reducing the people perception how dangerous it is. So, you know, we are already kind of immunized to that because we experienced that.
If I can throw in another comment on the information security, I mean, there have been pushes by some countries in the UN to push for the Information Security Act or regulation coordinating information security online. Why is the West against it? Well, there are a couple of reasons. First, back to what I said before, the fact that international law applies and it applies regardless, offline or online, and therefore the West believes that there shouldn't be any new specific legislation there, but we should extend the current norms and look how they apply in cyberspace. Secondly, and most importantly, I think there is difference of cultures or conceptions, because countries pushing for this seem to be interested in the way information to regulate. What do they want to regulate exactly? That's the question. That's the key question. And it seems that they want to regulate the content of the information and the way it is stored online. And that goes contrastingly against the Western principles of freedom of speech and the liberal democratic values that apply, again, online and offline.
So you dropped right into it. So we had, of course, now nearly the 20th year anniversary of the first UN General Assembly resolution by Russia against informational terrorism, as they called it, in which they have now expanded to the Code of Conduct. And the basis has been that we need a treaty, as you say, to regulate many of these activities, both interstate but also the activities of non-state actors. And you also mentioned that the predominant way of approaching this from a Western liberal democratic point of view is to concentrate on norms of behavior, rules of the road, of what states can do, interpreting existing international law rather than introducing new international law. But I still come back to the question, why is a treaty completely off the table? Microsoft, for instance, introduced something called the Geneva Convention for Cyberspace in an effort to try to move the discussion forward a little bit. What's the problem with these notions?
So let me first tie back to the other question. You know, I think we get hung up sometimes of thinking whether something's an armed attack or not is a binary choice in terms of whether you can react. So election interference is a hybrid situation of cyber-enabled, but a traditional influence operation. Even if it doesn't rise to the level of an armed attack, that doesn't mean you have to say that's good and you can't do anything about it. There's lots of things you can do. There's lots of tools you can use in your arsenal short of a use of force in response to something. And it may well be, depending on the seriousness, because it undermines the whole democratic system to be something greater than that. So I think we get caught up a little bit in this dichotomy. I do think that, personally, when I was in the government, I think most of my colleagues too, the cyber people really weren't looking at that as a threat. We were looking at threats to infrastructure, kind of the traditional attacks against infrastructure. We were worried about theft of intellectual property and theft of other information. The things we traditionally had seen. We're worried about the integrity of information. That would, if you change the integrity of information, that's almost worse than actually keeping information, the availability of information, because the integrity really causes all this doubt and can cause systems to go down or be unreliable. But I don't think we were ever focused on that threat. And that goes to the larger point that when you get to the treaty and the reasons why a lot of the more repressive regimes really like the idea of a treaty is because they want to control information. They look at information itself as a weapon. They look at it as destabilizing. They destabilize their regime, and so they need to control it. Whereas I think the U.S. and other countries look at cyber attacks as the weapon, and we're not trying to control information. There are some margins, child pornography, other things, but mostly the information is not something we're trying to control by cybersecurity. But that also raises a problem when you have these election interference issues, when you have these issues where we've seen this widespread manipulation of information to try to affect democratic processes. Democratic states cannot be in the role of deciding what's true and what's not true. They can't be saying, this is good information, this is bad. On the margins, again, yes, maybe, when it's clear, but mostly not. And so the way you combat that has to really be looking at a whole host of things that are not cyber tools that you use. And that goes then to the convention. I think I think you very well put the points of why a convention, which has been argued by Russia and China and others for a number of years, why that doesn't make sense. It also doesn't make practical sense, because if you ever try to get a convention through the UN system, that's not something that's done easily or quickly. And by the time you're done, you end up with something that is probably so watered down, because different parties will object to different parts of it, that it really doesn't help you very much. And you put all of your eggs and all of your efforts into that basket, rather than work on things where you could actually maybe get more security and a more secure infrastructure, like promoting norms of behavior, acceptable rules of state conduct, get more states to understand why that's important to them. And more importantly even, have those rules, but also have consequences for those who break rules, and working together to enforce that. I think that's the groundwork we need to do. But at the same time, look, these are conversations that happen. I don't fault Microsoft for proposing a conversation about this. I think Microsoft's, their narrative has changed over the past year, where they're not insisting there's a convention we need right now, but saying we need to talk about how we deal with this space. But we have to be worried about the goals that some of the more repressive regimes have, and will this actually achieve the things we want, which is better stability and preventing cyber conflict in an effective way.
So the importance of the social effects of internet usage in cyberspace on domestic populations in Russia and China, so there's viewing information as a weapon, sometimes encompassed in their notion of cyber sovereignty. They want to be able to control everything that happens within their cyberspace domain, all content that is produced, used, and utilized. What's the Chinese view on this exactly? How does it actually constrain, how does it work in the context of the internet, which is a borderless system?
Yeah, I think in terms of cyber sovereignty, this concept hasn't been used by many countries. I think that's because we do not understand the true meaning of the sovereignty in this virtual space yet. So I think, however, in my humble opinion, I feel like the concept of cyber sovereignty is very vital and very important when we see cyberspace as a potential battleground. But in terms of the concept sovereignty, I would argue actually it's not only about the power, but also about the responsibilities. So in that sense, if we want to claim our cyber sovereignty, which means we have to also show our responsibilities in this area as well. So, but the problem is, like we mentioned earlier, the cyber stuff is I would say, is a transnational problem, so that international law cannot solve the transnational problems. So I think in that sense, the cyber sovereignty can be a very good opportunity for us to pursue not only the power on it, but also the responsibilities on it as well.
Thank you, please.
Yeah, so what is also interesting, we should be really kind of careful in that space, cyberspace. Let's look back maybe 12 to 18 months back, and let's learn from that. It's very difficult to attribute certain cyber activities, where it originated, why it originated, and so on. If you look at on last, basically, US election, there was allegation of, collusions and so on and so on. And some hotheads even demanded the military response. There was even question, should they go to the war? Looking 18 months later, after endless investigation and so on, it turns out that was fake news, that basically collusion between Trump and other stuff. So because it's so hard to attribute these things, we have to take it from perspective. And if we have been listening to hotheads, we might have serious problem on our hands. So the fact that it's hard to attribute requires be extra cautious to dealing with these issues.
Sorry, just to clarify, are you saying that there is no evidence that there was a Russian attempt to influence the US election?
What I was saying, that there was no evidence uncovered of the collusion between Trump campaign. So I said something different.
But I'd say that's a separate issue. I mean, leave that aside for a second. If you have, it doesn't matter if it's the US and Russia or anyone, if you have a country who you clearly know, and our intelligence community clearly knew, and reached the conclusion that Russia was trying to interfere with their election. Whether they did it or not, that's a separate question. But everything you do has an effect, right? So you had a nation state, and every day really reveals it's even more concerted, and the sophistication, the method, and the Mueller indictment that came out a few months ago really detailed this in, I think, an amazing way. You had this attempt using cyber means and non-cyber means to do that. That has to be responded to. And this is one of the bigger problems I see here, is that as we think about what the norms are, what are the rules of the road in cyberspace, if nation states can do things that are outside those rules of the road, and there are no consequences for them for doing that, that creates its own norm, a norm of inaction, that where the nation state who does that can say, will be emboldened, say, well, why not do this again? There were no costs for us, and we got benefits, whatever those benefits might be. And so we've been really terrible, I think, of imposing those consequences and figuring out how to do them. collectively, not just one country, but collectively to do them. And they don't have to be cyber tools. They can be using cyber tools. That's one arsenal, but you generally would not use cyber against cyber, but you could. It could be one of the tools you have, and every nation's developing cyber tools, and we'll talk about that later, I know. They could be trade tools, sanctions tools, they could be law enforcement tools, diplomatic tools. I think one of the things that made a difference when we were pressing very hard against China and the theft of intellectual property, which happened over a 2.5-year period where we were pressing them on this constantly, is we didn't treat it as a cyber issue. We had President Obama saying, this is something we're willing to take a risk for in our overall relationship with China. So it's not just a cyber issue, it's an economic issue and a national security issue. We're going to raise it at every attempt, and we're going to threaten things like sanctions. And so that makes a difference. And I think if we don't do that better and do that more, and not get so hung up on attribution as hard, because yeah, it's hard to some extent, but again, we're able to make attribution. It's not impossible. I think the gap between attribution being made publicly and when it's actually decided, there is a gap because of technical issues, to be sure. There's a gap then because of coordination, either between your own interagency or your partners. And then there's the gap of political willingness of deciding at a leader level, hey, we need to do something about this. And all those things, I think, could be shortened.
Please.
Can I say something? I think we have to build up an equivalence principle between our physical world and this virtual world. That's because we all live in this physical world, and we use international laws to solve the problem and disputes. However, we rely on the cyberspace so heavily so that we still don't have any norms and any very universal rules to regulate this cyberspace. For instance, if we see driving a car on the road is very dangerous, so that we have to have a license in order to drive a car on the road. But why not? We don't have to have a license in order to surf on the internet. So I think we kind of like a lack of equivalent principles between these two worlds. That's why when we were attacked in cyberspace, we cannot say, oh, we are going to wage counterattack in cyberspace as well. That's also why I think it's very important to build up the concept of cyber sovereignty so that once your sovereignty has been intruded, then you can wage some certain defensive measures. But the problem is how we can have a common concept of cyber sovereignty in many state actors in the international parties. I think that's the problem.
So the concept of cyber sovereignty, and the way you just expressed it, basically also perhaps includes a redefinition of what an essential national interest is, a domain réservé, as it's known. So that may be construed by some governments as any interference in their political systems. If we talk about election security rather than electoral security, we want to protect our elections. Does that mean we want to protect it from any hostile opinion? That NGO is expressing an opinion we don't like. Is that an act of election security?
If we see election, okay, so put that way, if our elections has been conducted electronically in cyberspace, I think that would be the case. But the problem is because we don't know whether this attack is in our physical territory or our virtual cyber territory, if you like. So I think another thing is how we are going to build up the concept of cyber sovereignty is we have to territorialize the cyberspace first, so that when our social activities or our political activities conducted in cyberspace, then we know how or what kind of area or what kind of territoriality we are going to protect, including, of course, election, if election has been conducted in this space. Yeah.
I think some of our Chinese colleagues, mainland Chinese colleagues, would agree with you. Please.
A couple of comments on what you said, Chris. I just wanted to add that it's important perhaps to note that EU, during the Estonian presidency over the European Union Council last summer, adopted a cyber toolbox, which very well captures the possibilities of non-cyber reactions or retributions to, so to say, sub-Article 5 activities or the gray zone activities, including diplomatic measures, sanctions, financial and trade. So I just wanted to note that that is out there as well. Regarding sovereignty, I wanted to say that the main connection between sovereignty and cyberspace really is infrastructure. So surely, as states cannot claim sovereignty over the global cyberspace as such, but the same way that states have sovereignty over their territory and waters and people, they have sovereignty over their cyber infrastructure and all activities that can be associated with that. And from that derives the state responsibility and the due diligence and jurisdiction. For example, a state's right to pursue cyber criminals, and the due diligence, according to Italian manual, a sort of political advisors and legal advisors survival guide in Cyber Galaxy, published by our center. According to the Italian manual 2.0, there is a due diligence of the state. So that means that malicious activities, state has the responsibility to stop activities that are emanating from its cyber infrastructure.
So you mentioned, for instance, deterrence as a potential response option beyond, for instance, resilience, which is, of course, another topic that we can also return to a little bit later. But deterrence effectively means that there will be a promise of action. Has that promise ever been seen? We've had a norm of non-action that has been reinforced, and indeed many of the norms have been put forward within the UNGG, and others have been violated.
I think that's part of the problem. I mean, look, deterrence is a many varied concept, but part of deterrence is being able to take timely and credible action, right? Or having the threat to take timely and credible action. And so far, we've not been timely. And we've not been credible, particularly. And then we have recently imposed some sanctions, but we could argue those sanctions are not targeted in a way that would actually change the adversary's behavior, which is what you want to do. So we have to be much more agile in this, and we need to be much better at doing it. And I think what we've done with some of the public attribution is good, doing the not just one country, but getting a group of countries to act together. That's always better. You know, as I say, one of my colleagues used to say, use the term fiery ball of cyber death is coming toward you. If this fiery ball of cyber death is coming toward you, you have to do whatever you can to protect yourself. But normally you should have some time to get other partners to join with you because they're affected by this conduct too, and that makes the response more powerful. And I think we need to do a far better job of that than we have because we just haven't done it. Now, there are nuances to this, to be sure. One of the things we haven't really discussed is we don't really have clear escalation paths in cyberspace. We haven't done this enough to really understand how this will work or how the adversary or the bad actor is going to react to this. And I think we need to have much better diplomatic messaging, much better connections. So we're telling the bad guys, look, we're doing this to you, and we'll stop doing this to you when you stop doing this, and make that more credible. I think we can do that. I don't think attribution is as big a challenge to doing that as it has been in the past, but we haven't done it that much so far.
So attribution might not be a big challenge for some actors, obviously, or one actor in particular, but for other countries it might be a little bit more difficult, and particularly to get the information that they trust. So they have to rely upon an actor like the United States or similar to provide credible information. That's when you have the group of countries
acting together, and then that poses another challenge, which is sharing information between countries about these attacks. I remember when we had the North Korea attack on Sony Pictures, I called 20 of my different counterparts around the world and said, hey, tomorrow the president's going to go on TV and say it was North Korea. Love to get your support. And fairly, they said, great, give us all the evidence you can, because they want to make their own determination, which is actually fair. We did have a lot of contact between different parts of our government and them. But that needs to be staged. There has to be, we have to figure out how to do better information sharing. And there are challenges. There's classified challenges, intelligence challenges. There's law enforcement challenges. There's just logistical challenges. But that's part and parcel of getting that larger group to act against these bad actors.
So Raslav, one of the interesting things I noted about the Sony attack was when attribution was done in North Korea, on the technical lists that I am on, that you are on, others are on, there actually was
really
doubt.
When that happened, yes.
Yes, there was a lot of doubt if the US attribution was correct. The same people would have normally said, well, they're probably going to know. Now they just doubted it because there was very little trust in the moral integrity of the US government at that time to make the right pronouncement. How do you see that?
Well, actually I will try to shift a little bit discussion on put into following perspective. Imagine you are driving car and you don't pull the seat belt and you get injured. Well, that's partially kind of your problem. What I want to come to that is that, the cyber attacks and so on are consequence of something, consequence of security of the existing system infrastructure and effort which we put into infrastructure and so on. So, you know, let's take critical infrastructure in US. You know, how it's built, it's relatively weak and low, you know, easily to penetrate. So our effort to secure our system in everyday life, from, you know, banks, what we do daily, has certain cost. And you know, we stop with security to the level when it starts to be more expensive than basically economic damage. And you know, people talk about the security, but we have relatively lower levels. So you know, to reduce the cyber attacks, it's possible if people care enough and they spend additional money. They spend good enough money where the economical impact of the, you know, cyber attack is, you know, not significantly bigger than the money spent on that. So what I'm trying to say, we focus on how to respond and on certain activities in response. You know, we have non-state actors, we have criminals, which will be unable to deter successfully. What I'm trying to point that on cyber safety, you know, more focus needs to be spent there, which reduces probabilities of attack and consequences of attack. And so far, not enough effort was put there. So we need to increase the cyber defenses before we think how to respond with real weapons to the attack.
So you raise an important point about resilience and how to be able to absorb potential cyber activity rather than only emphasizing deterrence measures or counterattack.
Exactly.
But the question is how is that ever going to be possible? From speaking as a technologist, as a hacker, can you really make a perfectly secure system?
Well, let's look what we can see. Let's look nuclear weapons. You know, nuclear weapons code is designed in different way, more expensive way technologically, with much less vulnerabilities. This is one of the extreme, and we did not have as much problem there, but it's very economically challenging. However, you know, spending incremental amount of money allows to basically increase the safety, and you know, it's safer from the state point of view than basically trying to have retaliate with, you know, offensive methods. So it has to be right balance. We cannot just focus only on offensive. There is ability to safeguard internal infrastructure, and what I can tell, the system can be built which have incredible level of security, much higher than is today. It will be little inconvenient, but there is no will to that, because the damages from cyber attacks are not to the level that people will be willing to spend additional money and effort to secure that. Yeah, technologically can be secured. Technology exists. It was proven, but it's inconvenient and is not being deployed.
But again, we haven't done a great job at that either. I mean, part of deterrence is deterrence by denial, and we have not done a great job. And I think there are limits to what we can do. I mean, I think there are lots of technologies that may come down the pike, but we're not there yet. And then just on your point, yeah, it was frustrating when everyone was saying it was North Korea, and then Obama said it was North Korea, and then all the people said, well, it's not North Korea anymore. And we probably produced more evidence than we normally would in this kind of case. The law enforcement agencies and others really made the case they could, but we're never going to disclose, and no country is ever going to disclose all the information they have. The intelligence and other information is never going to all come out. Because it ends up being, attribution ends up being, again, at the end of the day, a political issue. It's not along a scale of 80%, 100%. It's when a country feels confident they can make it, and they're not going to release all that evidence. Apparently Seth Rogen now doesn't think it's North Korea. I read that the other day. The computer expert, Seth Rogen. So, you know, so I think that is a challenge, but you have to build trust by doing these things over and over, and also helps when you're doing it with others.
Well, can I say, I think this topic that you mentioned, this case that you mentioned, brings us to the wider relevance of the importance of having these high-level people in place to do that work, to do that outreach to their colleagues in like-minded nations, and to prepare these attributions or which are closely linked to the deterrence decisions of our leaders. So we growingly, as we mentioned earlier, as there have been more repeated high-level attributions now, that underlines the point that the issue is going political, and therefore we need people who understand cyber as advisors at the political level, political advisors or just high-level people who can coordinate and exercise leadership in this.
I mean, we need people to both mainstream this, but also to get the folks who don't deal with this every day to understand why this is an important issue. And you need a high-level person to do that. You know, the example just recently, which I'm sure many of the people in this audience have read about, of the cyber coordinator role at the White House being eliminated. The U.S. has an unfortunate track record of getting the rest of the world to say this is a good idea and following us and then changing our mind. And this is a bad example of changing our mind, because a lot of other countries were doing similar things. When I was at the State Department, I was a cyber coordinator there. They'll probably recreate that position. We'll see what happens, but it was demoted for a long period of time. You know, you need these people in these positions to do this. And Rob Joyce, who was the coordinator at the Munich Security Conference, was one of the people who led the attribution. He made the announcement about the attribution, not Petia. And because of his background, because of his experience, because of his level within the government, it made a difference to have someone at that level. And it also makes a difference to again, get other policymakers to understand this issue. And if you start eliminating those roles and just treat cyber as this backwater kind of thing, you're never going to get the action that you need.
Before we continue with the cyber capabilities question, I just wanted to ask if there are some comments or questions from the audience. This would be, we're about halfway, so this would be a good time to turn to the audience. Please. Gentleman over here.
Hi, thanks for the great comments from the panel. Philip Chertoff from the Geneva Center for Security Policy. So I wanted to get back to the question of attribution, because one of the things that we've kind of come to understand over the last year especially is that a lot of times operations undertaken in cyberspace are actually carried out by proxies. Which always makes it difficult to attribution, is that you can attribute up to a certain point, but then it might be more difficult to say, well, this former Russian criminal was actually acting under the orders of Vladimir Putin. So I guess I was just wondering if the panel could maybe react to the use of proxies in cyberspace, and whether we can really ever assert state responsibility for an operation through the use of proxies.
Interesting, the proxies, the use of proxies was addressed in one of the GG, the Group of Governmental Experts reports, I think 2 of them actually, where it said that states shouldn't be able to do things that they can't do themselves through proxies. Now, it doesn't mean they won't do it, it just means that they shouldn't do it. And it is a challenge. It's a challenge to attribution. However, I think it's, I think that you don't just simply follow the digital footprints back. And if you have an incident that's not a single point incident, but something that takes place over a period of time, you're going to be able to trace back who the actor is. And you're going to look at not just the digital footprints, you're going to look at motivations, you're going to look at human intelligence, you're going to look at all the things you have, and you're going to figure out over time, and this has been done now on a number of occasions. Yes, it makes it more difficult. Absolutely. Just like criminals and nation states routing through their attacks through many different countries to avoid detection. Absolutely, that makes it more difficult. But I don't think it's impossible.
So you mentioned, of course, proxies as a point, and then the U.S. Indictment of the 5 PLA employees a couple of years back for engaging in intellectual property theft has been seen as one possible option to solve any kind of proxy problem. Because if these employees were moonlighting, as it were, working on their own time and stealing intellectual property secrets for a state-owned enterprise, which is what the indictment says, then the U.S. position simply was implying that it doesn't really matter that you are working on behalf of a government, and therefore you're not a proxy, you are effectively under effective control of that state, and therefore we're going to assign responsibility to that state. And so is proxy still a major issue, do you think, that needs to be addressed, or do we have the tools to address it?
Well, I think it is a major issue, and we have tools, and we need to address it. According to the Tallinn manual interpretation, this question links to the due diligence issue, that ultimately the state is responsible for any activity. The state must not allow their cyber infrastructure be used on the cyber infrastructure on their territory be used in a way that causes damage to other states. And if the users are proxies, the state nevertheless has responsibility. And if through various levels of attribution, the digital footprints, and linked with the rest of the intelligence added up at the political level, they are being found out, then that they are targeting another state, the other state, the one under attack, has always the possibility to address the state whose territory is being used and ask the proxies to be shut down. Another issue I wanted to mention here, we're talking a lot about the attribution, but I think equally it is important to maintain not only what strategic communication and what can be done to the bad guys, but how we can help and show solidarity with allies who are being attacked. And this is important. This is something that NATO has been thinking and doing about for about 11 years now. And this is something our center feels very strongly about, that we have to have procedures in place to show solidarity, but also to assist, if need be, a party under attack.
So in the recent executive orders that the US government put out against Russia and Iran because of cyber activity, they list a number of private entities that were working on behalf of the government. So that's one of the examples that you gave of effectively the due diligence principle being exercised.
But there's also this thing that some people have thrown around of exactly what we're saying, taking due diligence to the next level, that it's almost like a last clear chance doctrine. You go to a country and you say, look, there's malicious activity coming out of your country, it's attacking our country, I don't care who it is, make it stop. And if they either can't make it stop because they're incapable, or they don't because they don't want it to stop, then the argument is you might be able to take some actions at that point. Now, there's lots of issues with that, to be sure, but I think we're starting to move toward how you can address this issue. Because too often you go to states and you say, can you take care of this? And they'll say, oh, we don't see anything, or we don't have any information on that.
Or they just don't respond. They just don't pick up the phone.
Raslav?
So I would like to, we have been looking backwardly in time, for things what happen, but I would like to bring some kind of forward-looking issue because they are more significant. Let me try to explain. In the past, most of the cyber attacks was kind of on infrastructure, information, denial of service attacks and so on, in the banks and so on. But what we are facing now is very different situation coming. Let's think about self-driving car, where in the past, the cyber attack typically led to economical impact, negative impact. But, few years down the road, there will be tens of thousands self-driving cars. The actually cyber attack might end up with high level the mass casualties. And we need to think how we'll do things differently, what we need to change. We need to put in place regulation on basically robots, cars, and so on, self-driving, safe-flying systems, to basically be ready for inevitability of next cyber attack. And we need to work today to think and prevent it. Otherwise, we'll be in bigger trouble.
Okay, thank you. Gentleman over here, please.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Igor Shenkarchin. I'm coming from Slovakia, from Cyberstring company. It's a perfect debate, and you just came with point which I wanted to raise somehow. Maybe I will have some comments first, and then maybe hope some question. All of us, we experience a lot of examples with the social media impacts. If we look at back, we had so many situations with so dramatic impact, and if we talk regulation, where we are today. We are still just debating. We don't have, in fact, a well-working regulations which would really somehow tackle this situation. So we are somehow, also when we talk the cybersecurity regulations and the acts, we are always in a reactive mode. Now, if we start to debate the artificial intelligence, comparing to social media, I think we are far beyond what we can just imagine it will come. So my question is, do we have a really chance to be, again, reactive? Should not we really start to be proactive already? And my key question is, who should take the leadership in this role? Because we are clearly aware that it cannot be done just by one entity. but somebody needs to take the lead. If you could maybe touch this
All right,
question.
so how do we get ahead of the curve and be more proactive rather than reactive? I guess it's a $10,000 question. Chris, you want to pick it up?
Well, I mean, first of all, I want to disaggregate the question a little bit because there is a difference between social media and cyber attacks. I mean, social media, and we have to be careful, again, as democratic societies, that we're not saying what's good information and what's bad information. There's a lot of things in terms of disclosure and transparency and privacy policies and other things that you can, in fairness, talk about social media and how they interact. Or, as one executive has said recently, I won't tell you whether a piece of information is true or not, but I'll tell you if it's a real person or not, if it's a bot or a real person. So I think there are a lot of things that can be done there in the social media space, and to me that's different. I mean, it's analogous, but it's different than the cyber attack space. And try to get ahead of that. I mean, I think there's a number of things we can do. I think we can have better resilience. I think we need to have more consequences so we deter some of the bad actors. I think we need to have a lot more universal acceptance of some of these norms and behaviors we've talked about. And not only once they're promulgated by nation states. I mean, our commission, the Commission on the Global Stability of Cyberspace, to put in a plug for it, has been working on not just manufacturing new norms, but we have one new norm that talks about not essentially attacking the public core of the internet. That states should not do that because it will have such widespread effects. But also getting more countries to buy into that idea, and to think about how you can get wider acceptance globally of this, and also what other stability measures you can take place. And that's only part of the problem. So, I think there are a number of things. I don't think we'll ever be completely ahead of the problem. I think it's going to be a cat and mouse game, just like it has been with cybercrime for 25 years. I used to be a prosecutor doing cybercrime, and that certainly hasn't changed. But I do think part of us getting ahead of it goes back to something I said earlier on. It can't just be the cyber cognoscenti. It can't just be the cyber priesthood or that walks around thinking about this. It has to be ingrained to larger national security policy.
So also I will add to that actually there are attempts to be ahead. For example, in United States now is high priority what is called SCADA update, critical infrastructure, where there is high priority to replace system 10, 15 years old in the field from electrical grid and so on to be more resilient. So now other countries, for example in Europe, we should follow that and make it priority, like US is doing SCADA update. Basically, Europe should also review the infrastructure and start similar program to bring in on the par the systems to higher level. So there are things to do proactively, and some of them are happening. They are just not publicized widely, but we need more of them.
Just on that point, one used to say that the European infrastructure was sometimes a little bit more advanced than the U.S. infrastructure, and therefore was more vulnerable, and that gave the U.S. some resilience. And now that they're updating their infrastructure, they're now getting increasingly vulnerable to attacks that they weren't vulnerable to 15 years ago or 10 years ago. Please.
I wanted to throw in my two cents here to see the glass half full, or I don't know if it's personal or if it comes from the Estonian EU presidency experience, but I do see EU coming up with directives that try to mitigate this situation. I don't know if it's ahead of the curve, but when we heard Zuckerberg hearing in the Senate, there were lots of comments about the issues that the US is only now starting to tackle, being something that Europe has been thinking and doing for a while. And I refer to the Privacy Act. I refer to the European Right to be Forgotten principle that is implying, and I refer to the EU Network Information Security Directive, which addresses the critical infrastructure protection and sets in some very clear rules so that to raise the overall resilience of the EU. It includes a rule that every country strictly have to define their cyber vital service providers. They have to point a point of contact who is responsible for auditing the cyber security rules of these private actors, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, it sounds tedious and bureaucratic, but I see use in this. And finally, you seem to ask, well, to me, your question referred to the AI type of looking ahead of the curve. What can we do about that? And to me, that that there is an idea there that what we see currently happening in the social media, Facebook, Google, and so on, refers to the importance of that we need to look the big picture, that we need to take care, not just look at the technicality, the technology are matters that that are important for the whole of society. So when what's in it there for the private sector is a possibility to sponsor research and studies on the impact of AI on society at large, so that we'd have more social science people who understand the results that the technology advancements have, and rather than have the stop the killer robots campaigns, which rather instead of that to look at the impact of the technology and to a little bit less emotionally invest into having social scientists who can see the picture at large.
So we cyber people usually talk about more machine learning than anything else and the application of the algorithms that you need to do proper big data analytics. But how do you do those big data analytics if you have something like the GDPR, which is going to make it sometimes quite difficult, for instance, to collect that information, to make those kinds of choices? Aren't we reaching a point where we have to make that kind of choice? Do we want to double down and protect our personal information? Or do we want to fully exploit the technology and see where it brings us? Václav?
Well, I can just say I don't think it's black or white. I think you can have both, and the debate about GDPR seems to be very zero-sum game, whereas I don't think it really is, because the privacy is something very, very important to many, many people in Europe. So EU has been addressing that, but and it's important to address that concern. Whereas surely, to advance, you need to be able to analyze big data as well. So I think there is a way of doing both.
I'd like to check if there's some further questions from the audience. The lady over here, please. Yeah. Any others?
Hello, Tatiana Jancharko of the Czech Republic's National Cybersecurity Center. I'd like to go back to the issue of international law and norms of behavior in cyberspace. I was wondering the panelists' opinion or comment on a premise that by refusing in principle the idea of a treaty for cyberspace, the logic of which I do understand and agree with in principle. So by doing so, do we not risk seeing the process being hijacked by private sector, non-state actors initiatives like Digital Geneva Convention, Tech Accord, and so on, and then subsequently having major difficulties in ascertaining the states, the government's role in the cyberspace governance, in fact. So how do we then want to enforce international law, which primarily deals with state actors? Thank you.
Is government playing catch up? Yeah.
So, I mean, look, I think governments obviously had the primary role in regulating, state conduct, obviously, but that doesn't mean that other stakeholders don't have a role in that either. And I actually don't have a problem with the private sector and others coming forward with ideas, and I don't think it hijacks the process. I think it actually helps inform the process. At the end of the day, states are going to decide what to do in their best interest. But at the same time, it does make a difference when a lot of the infrastructure is owned by the private. You want to get those opinions. There's been a lot of good work, frankly, done by Microsoft on norms when we were doing this with states too, and I think there was a lot of consistency between those norms and other companies too. And I think, the more of those other stakeholders you can draw in the discussion, that's helpful. It helps inform that debate. At the same time, I don't think simply by saying you're not going to go down the lane of a treaty for all the reasons that we discussed means you're abandoning the field. You're walking off. What you need to do is you need to substitute something in for that. And the thing where I think we're substituting is like, look, maybe 10 years from now, 20 years from now, maybe we'll have a treaty. Who knows? But in the interim, what we need to do is get much more understanding of countries around the world, not just the normal suspects, but countries around the world, including developing world countries, and what this means. get further, I think, understanding and embracing of the stability structure, which is international law applies in cyberspace. We're still figuring out how, but it applies. So it's not a free fire zone. That there are norms of behavior below the threshold of armed conflict, things like don't steal the intellectual property of another country to benefit your commercial sector, don't attack the critical infrastructure of another country absent wartime, different rules in wartime, like LOAC and others. Don't attack the certs, they're like the hospitals, the ambulances, certain, or don't attack the public core of the internet, that you get countries to agree to, and through that, and that's not something that happens overnight, and it didn't happen overnight in the nuclear or other world, it happens over time, and get countries to agree to that, and then make sure there are consequences for bad actors who violate those norms. I think that's how you build that, and that does fill that gap. It's not like there's this yawning thing where no one's doing anything. So I think we need to be aggressive and continue to push that agenda, while at the same time having these discussions with all the stakeholders that we need to.
How do you actually see, though, that developing? Because if we have a situation where, for instance, one country or a bunch of countries see their primary interest in maintaining cyber sovereignty, being able to protect their own information borders, and they don't really care about international law to the same extent that the Western actors do, and they definitely don't care about international humanitarian law, because in their worldview, if you're really in war, full war, then all the gloves are off and there are really few rules to follow. And they don't even accept the premise that there's a big difference between wartime and peacetime. In fact, going by the Estonian intelligence service report just of a couple of weeks ago, that is officially how the Russian government assesses the situation. They don't go by wartime and peacetime rules, they effectively operate by the same rules all the time. So how do we respond to a situation like that?
I think in Taiwan, because we are right now working on a so-called national cybersecurity strategy, and in that we are talking about how we can conduct transformation from the peacetime to the wartime, when, especially in cyberspace. I think more or less we have to consider the connections between this physical world and the virtual world. For example, because in Taiwan we already got a lot of cyber attacks, obviously. And if we, technically speaking, we can trace back to a geographical location. For instance, like in mainland China, maybe even though we cannot argue or prove these cyber attacks has been supported by the government, but however, I think the government in that geographical area has the responsibility to maintain the security and maintain and solve the problem happened in cyberspace. So in that sense, if we go back to the international law and go back to norms, I think we still have a long way to go. But because I think the problem is we have a very different concept to one another, and we needed to reach a common ground in a conceptual level first.
Well, what you call the consistent violation of norms, or some countries not applying, it is a tricky question. I think in reality, we must, most states, I think, do follow their obligations, and while some don't, they stick out. But it doesn't make the norms non-existent. Norms do change when new treaties are signed, or when new customary international law is being set up, and that's the process that Chris just mentioned. And that is a very long process, and customary law evolves through state actions.
Thank you. Any other questions? So I want to come back to the point that was also mentioned beforehand about points of context and cyber capabilities. So many governments, of course, are setting up offensive capabilities. There's always a report that about 25 or 35, depending on who you ask, governments now officially declare to have offensive capabilities. China's position has long been that this is escalatory, that just by talking about cyber conflict or even cyber war, we raise the risk of it actually happening, and we shouldn't exchange any documents, let alone any type of legal understandings, to make sure that this doesn't occur. Is that a realistic interpretation of the threat? Is information exchange in this context only likely to effectively increase the spiral of threat, or is it actually just a method of a negotiation tool on the behalf of the Chinese and others?
I think it's a very weird argument, actually, because that's like arguing in the physical world we should not have things like the law of armed conflict in the physical world, because even having that would then create a physical war, which it's not. I mean, it's the whole idea of the law of armed conflict was to address the excesses of war and make sure that we never had those excesses again, and really try to create some order around that, recognizing that you don't want to go to war. It's not a license to go to war, but it's trying to put some rules around them. And the same is true for cyberspace. There's nothing in talking about the application of, for instance, LOAC to cyberspace that it all says we want to have a cyber war. And the way it's been expressed to me at one point was, if we agree to this, if we think it applies, that then gives you, the other side, license to attack us. Well, let me tell you something. You don't need the agreement on the law of armed conflict applying for a country to decide in their own self-interest if there is, if they're able to under international law because there has been sufficient, armed attack or something else for a country to respond. They can anyway. They don't need an agreement from the other country the law of armed conflict applies. So that seems like a specious argument to me. So I'm not really sure where that argument comes from. I think it's a somewhat odd argument, and maybe because they just don't want to discuss it, because they just don't want to limit their capabilities. I don't really know. The other thing I'd say, though, is what does worry me, and this is going to happen. I mean, we could say till the cows come home, countries should not develop cyber capabilities. That's never going to happen. I remember an RSA conference maybe 5 years ago where someone gave a keynote and said, we want to ban on all countries developing cyber capabilities. Never going to happen. Completely unrealistic. They will, just like they have in everything else. Countries will develop capabilities. And they are. Almost every country that can, and every country that can is, and every country that can't aspires to. And so you're going to have more countries have these capabilities. That does risk having a real de-escalating or an escalating effect because there's not a lot of doctrine around this. I think countries need to have doctrine about their cyber capabilities, how they use them, when they use them, how that fits in their general defensive and offensive capabilities. And I think a part of that goes back to the norms we were talking about. If there are rules of the road of, not what kind of weapon you can use, because I don't know what a cyber weapon is, but what kind of effect you have, the effects you're trying to prohibit in peacetime, that I think goes a long way to try to get that stability. But I do worry about countries having this proliferation of these capabilities because they're not controlling it, and also having no doctrine around it. Some countries do have doctrine, and I think that's good, and I think that as transparent as you can be about your doctrine as possible is really helpful.
I would like to pick this up because this is a very important point, both the proliferation question and the whole question of what a cyber weapon constitutes. There have been many attempts to limit the proliferation of offensive cyber capabilities. The Wassenaar Agreement was updated, for instance. But also, the question still hasn't been adequately resolved for most people. What is a cyber weapon, and how do we distinguish between a legitimate software tool, for instance, something called Metasploit, which is used to test systems, or even email, and a complex cyber weapon? So a question to you, is there a hope that we can actually define a cyber weapon, or is there better ways to limit the proliferation of offensive cyber capabilities?
So, I think it will be fuzzy area because, tools which are commercial tools for testing, they can be modified, subverted to offensive attacks, escapes from intelligence agency offensive attacks with modification are being used in other field. And actually it touches on previous issue about the responsibility and sharing information. Let me make some practical examples. Sometimes agencies, they discover vulnerabilities which can be used for offensive means, and it's kind of mixed feeling. If you release that information, you lose the capability which you discovered and maybe other did not discover. So sometimes there is tendency not to share the information because other might not discover it. Another aspect is sharing information responsibly is dangerous. For example, the vulnerabilities are being discovered, they are published too early before affected countries and so on can respond and safeguard that. So now there are kind of attempts to create kind of code of conducts. There are a lot of independent researchers which they discover vulnerability which can be basically militarized. And some of these research institutes start following contacts and procedures that they share that with targets month before it's being released, examples of Intel vulnerability where there was vulnerability in every processor chip, and it was discovered in Austria, in US independently, and they follow procedure to give 2-3 months through informal channel. They provided communication such that society prepared ourselves. So it's very important role on creating this code of conduct of responsible and following that to not aggravate the situation.
So you mentioned something that is known as a coordinated vulnerability disclosure processes, where software flaws that are recently discovered go through a process to make sure they're not used by illegitimate hackers first. And the US maintains, for instance, one of the original processes is called a vulnerability equity process. And one of the best arguments, or intellectual arguments, that Michael Hayden, the CIA and NSA director who was was in office when the process was set up, was why this was such a complex subject was the no-bus argument, that he would sometimes argue that the US government would have to consider, when they have find a vulnerability, if anyone except the United States could exploit this vulnerability. So no one but us can actually exploit this vulnerability. Therefore, the question is, should we release it or not? So my question to you is, when you're developing these coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies, or VEP policies, which is something, Chris, for instance, you have an interest in, for instance, how do you solve that issue about effectively drawing attention to perhaps to a vulnerability that doesn't actually indicate an attack vector, but now people think, wow, that might be an option? You just mentioned one, for instance, with the Intel chips that was recommended. Now, a lot of people are starting to look the same direction, going, even though that process worked really well, now a lot of people are thinking, hey, what else can we discover down here? How do we do this balance between revealing a threat and actually causing new threats that inevitably has to happen?
So first, I think every government should have a vulnerability equities process, and a transparent process, or as transparent as you can. You might not be able to be transparent about the decisions themselves, various reasons, but where you weigh the law enforcement, intelligence, other value, the really public safety value, national security value, versus the value of disclosing a vulnerability where you can actually protect the infrastructure. And I think in the US, it's shifted substantially over the years, where the presumption is to disclosure. And I don't think it's solely around NOBIS. I don't think it's solely, we have this and no one else does, because you never know when that could be discovered in the future. So that's not a really great metric to use, I think. The question, though, then comes to responsible disclosure. So you don't want to disclose a vulnerability and publish it in the front page of the New York Times, where then every hacker could take advantage of it. You want to work with the vendors and work with others who have that, so you can have a patch in place, and you can make sure that as you're disclosing this, you're actually doing precautionary measures. Now, to be sure, people don't patch very quickly, and that always creates some problem. But I think if you want to make the overall ecosystem more secure, disclosure, erring on the side of disclosure or presuming disclosure is a better course. Now, of course, there'll be times when governments need to keep vulnerabilities for law enforcement and other reasons to protect their citizens, and that will outweigh it. But there needs to be a process that's transparent. The US has a process. They have a second version of a process. The UK is looking at a process. A number of other countries are. I think the more countries that look at that, the better. I don't expect certain countries to ever have a vulnerability equities disclosure process. I don't really expect Russia to jump to that. But I think the more countries that do that will make the ecosystem safer.
In some cases, we have a problem, of course, that like in Internet of Things, you have situations where firmware effectively has hard-coded vulnerabilities in it that can't effectively be updated. How do we best address this? Is it best to try to approach it with a regulation aspect, a trade aspect? Countries like China, for instance, have complained that since so many IoT devices are produced in China, any type of move to effectively make regulation that improves the security of these IoT devices is effectively going to be action against them. So are we to try something else, or is this the best way to approach the IoT dilemma and the vulnerability dilemma is effectively to just simply use regulation and trade?
I think this is an evolving area. I think especially where you have sort of mission critical things like self-driving cars, health, IoT, that the need to have some sort of regime might be greater. But there's also a number of things you could do, like the equivalent of a UL listing, like where you try to make clear what products are safer, and that changes the market over time. The problem with Internet of Things is often these devices are commodities, and so there's not a lot of incentive to build in the cybersecurity into it because people are not willing to pay the extra cost, and that's always been a problem in this area. I don't think people are generally willing to pay the extra cost for cybersecurity across the board. So, I think there are incentive things you can look at. In certain cases, you might want to look at regulatory aspects, but the thing is it has to be consistent. It can't be this patchwork of different regimes around the world.
I think when we talk about IoT, I think that's kind of, we have to go back to think about the responsibilities amongst not only state actors, but also non-state actors. Because as we all know, for private sector, they have their own autonomy, their own right to protect their property. But however, they also have their responsibility. The problem is how this private sector is able to negotiate and work with state actors, not only domestically, but also internationally. So I think that's why we have to build up not only treaty, but also transnational norms in order to allow these private sectors are able to work with other state actors in this international world.
Can I just jump on one? The NIST framework of the U.S., the National Institute for Standards and Technology for Critical Infrastructure, was a collaborative process, it's a voluntary process. That's worked, I think, very well. The EU is now considering cybersecurity legislation, which is part of it is standardization. I think it's driven by some of these IoT issues. But we got to be careful that these are not, standards that are unique to Europe. That they're international standards. If they're standard, that they're. I think there's a lot to be said for voluntary standards, at least initially. They're not moving to more prescriptive ones. And there has to be really a feedback loop and a close connection with the industry you're trying to work with, so that you get the best information, like that was done with the NIST framework. So I think there's a lot that can be done. I know that legislation is still working its way through, and I think there's a number of things that can be done to make that as effective as possible, and just to not have an inconsistent or local regulatory regime, which won't help anyone.
So we're going to take one more question, and then I'm going to ask a final question of the group, and that question is going to be, so you have some time to prepare, is how big is the threat of inadvertent escalation in cyberspace? So many of the processes that we see in the OSCE and the UN and similar are directed against this type of accidental war occurring, accidental conflict breaking out, and also loss of escalation control. How do we control, for instance, the de-escalation process once these things have arisen? So I'm going to ask each of you then how large you consider this risk of inadvertent escalation in cyberspace. But first I'd like to ask the gentleman over there to pose his question.
Thank you. Nina Milicevic from Microsoft. And I was having a long debate with myself whether I should say something or not, because Chris effectively responded very well for me already. And I have noticed a number of the positive things that were said by several people on this panel about our work on norms and the Digital Geneva Convention. But I did want to respond to the comment, I guess, from a member of the audience earlier on. None of our work in this space, whether it's on norms or on the Digital Geneva Convention, at any point was intended to hijack what was being done at the state level, and I think we've gone out of our way to make that very clear. It was always about promoting that work, contributing to it, and as I think, as Alex had said earlier, to push it forward in a constructive manner. So I just wanted to really be very clear on that. It was never about hijacking, and I think we've gone out of our way to present it like that, so thank you.
Okay. So then my question to all of you. Inadvertent escalation and the loss of escalation control, how big is the threat really? Chris?
So I do worry about it. I think we don't have good escalation paths now. People really don't know what to expect and how to respond. One of the things I think we need to do is really, and this goes to the point of imposing consequences for bad actions too, is communicate to both adversaries and friends. Here, not clear red lines, because then people creep up to the red lines, but but here are the things that we find unacceptable. Here are the kinds of actions we're going to take. We're going to try to take them collectively, and then communicate clearly with the people you're imposing these on during the time you're doing it, because otherwise there is no clear understanding of how this works, and people could misinterpret it. They could react in different ways. The out-of-band of cyber is not going to be cyber on cyber again. So I do think there's a real risk now because that basic understanding is not there, and the basic communication between countries is not there, and that's what we need to strengthen. And look, on the other point that was just made, I think the more debate we can have on these things is better. I think that the Russians and China of the world wanted a convention to control information. That was never the intent of the companies that were arguing this, so it's a different issue, and it's just trying to spur some of this debate and how you deal with some of these issues.
Well, I also agree. I think the chance of inadvertent escalation is very high. Malicious code, once released to the internet, has the ability to be manipulated and spread fast and far beyond what it was originally intended to. And NotPetya is a good example of that. I think it was, well, it's clear it was originally intended to cause damage to Ukraine, but it reached far beyond that and became one of the most damaging campaigns last year. As a way of mitigating that, I think it's important, I'd like to underline my previous point that while attribution is important, we also need to focus at what are ways to bilaterally and collectively show solidarity and work procedures how to help and support an ally that is being hit. And NATO has been focusing on that very much lately, both through political discussions, focusing on resilience building, but also through very practical exercises, training and exercises, which are an important part of building skills and building trust among allies.
Thank you.
So actually, I worry more and more, and there are two reasons for that. One is the technological and one is societal. On technological reason, more and more tools and responses are being automated. Countermeasure are automated and so on. We saw the effect of uncontrolled automation in stock market, where you have this, they call it the kind of like storm, the second order effect, which they are causing unintended consequences, where the system automatically selling shares are causing these huge dips. So the automatic countermeasures basically done by AI and software are less under control of people. So there's a technological aspect. The societal aspect is that there is tendency in last year or 2 years towards kind of like hot-headed approaches, let's respond, so let's attack, and then let's investigate later what really happened. And, we saw in Syria, Duma recently, attack started before an investigation started. So there is kind of hot-headedness together with automation, where the automation is so fast that people don't even know what happened, and they figure out that after effect. We see that on the stock market sometimes, and that's what's worried me, both aspects.
In my humble opinion, I think I would like to draw your attention on an issue, which is the lack of trust. Because when we talk about no matter whether it's bilateral or multilateral cooperations amongst the states or sectors, I think we still have to work on the trust between them. For instance, like as we all know, cyberspace as an information infrastructure are owned by private companies in many countries. So how the government sector is able to not only work with this private sector domestically, but also to build up a mutual trust between them. For instance, especially for cybersecurity, I think the shared information is the vital measure to maintain and to conduct like an exercise I mentioned earlier. So I think even though we do have some treaties or cooperation or allies in this international arena, but I have to say the lack of trust is still the biggest problem for us in order to pursue a very good stage.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is, I think, quite clear that this fifth domain is a very complex and vibrant environment, and it has a lot of moving parts to it. And we're not able to address all those parts individually, but I hope you can also approach the speakers in the break and bring up points that you thought were missed in the discussion, and also the next couple of days, because one thing is for sure, cyberspace is going to be here tomorrow. The topics will be here tomorrow as well, and hopefully we'll have some more solutions as well. So thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our panelists.